Nobody wrote the real obituary for Walter Pidgeon. The one they wrote, the one that ran in the Los Angeles Times on September the 26th, 1984. And in Variety and in the Hollywood Reporter and in the wire services that distributed the news of his death to the newspapers that still carried obituaries of people who had been famous 40 years earlier and who were dying at 87 in the specific obscurity that Hollywood reserves for its former leading men when the leading has been over long enough that the forgetting has become nearly total. That obituary was accurate. It listed the films: Mrs. Miniver, How Green Was My Valley, Madame Curie, Forbidden Planet. The long, distinguished, commercially reliable catalog of a man who had been one of the most dependable leading men in MGM's history across 3 decades. The man who could be put opposite any major female star of the 1940s and who would give the production what it needed, and would not create difficulties, and would arrive prepared, and would leave having done the work. That obituary was accurate, and it was not the real obituary. The real obituary is the one nobody wrote. The one that required knowing things about Walter Pidgeon that the industry knew and that the public did not know and that the people who knew them understood. In the specific way of people who are inside a system that has organized itself around the management of such information, was not information that the public account of a man's life was going to include. Tonight, my friend, I want to write the real obituary, not because I am going to tell you that Walter Pidgeon was a bad man. He was not a bad man. By every account from every person who worked with him or knew him across the 6 decades of his professional life, he was a man of genuine decency, not the performed decency of someone who is managing the impression of decency for commercial reasons, but the actual decency of a man who treated the people around him with the specific quality of respect and consideration that the people around him consistently described as one of his most characteristic and most reliable qualities. Not because I am going to tell you that the films were fraudulent. They were not fraudulent. The performances in Mrs. Miniver and How Green Was My Valley are real performances of real quality, and the quality is the quality of an actor who is genuinely doing the work, rather than managing the appearance of doing the work. I am going to write the real obituary because the real obituary contains things that the false version, the accurate, published version, left out. And the leaving out of those things produced a public record of a man's life that is incomplete in ways that matter. Not for the scandal of the incompleteness, because the things that were left out are not scandalous in the sense that the word scandal implies something that the person being scandalized should be ashamed of. But because the incompleteness is itself the story. And the story is a story about what Hollywood in the 1940s and 1950s required of certain people, and what the requiring of it cost, and what the cost looked like across 87 years of a life. The real obituary begins earlier than the published one. The published one began in St. John, New Brunswick, in the year 1897. The real one begins in the same place, but at a different moment. A moment that the published obituary could not include, because the moment was the moment of a private grief that was never made public and that organized the interior life of the man the subsequent career was built around, in ways that the career itself was organized around not showing. Walter Davis Pidgeon was born on the 23rd of September, 1897, in St. John, New Brunswick, Canada, the son of Caleb Elisha Pidgeon and Hannah Weston Pidgeon. He was the second of 3 children. He was raised in the specific environment of small city maritime Canada in the early 20th century, an environment that was Protestant and respectable and organized around the specific values of the maritime mercantile class: work, propriety, the careful management of the public presentation of the self in a community where the community's judgment of the self was a practical rather than merely social consideration. He had, from early, the voice. The voice is the thing about Walter Pidgeon that everyone who encountered him in any context described first, because the voice was the thing that was first, and it was the thing that was most immediately and most completely remarkable. It was a baritone of the specific richness and resonance that is not manufactured by technique, but is simply given. The voice of a man whose vocal apparatus was constructed in a way that produced a quality of sound that the ear receives differently from other voices. Not simply pleasant, not simply well-trained, but the specific sound of a voice that has a quality of weight and warmth that the ear trusts in the specific way, that the ear trusts things that are given rather than manufactured. He wanted to be a singer. This is the first fact about Walter Pidgeon that the published obituaries mentioned, and that the real obituary requires more careful treatment of, because the wanting to be a singer and what happened to the wanting is the organizing fact of the early life, in a way that the subsequent career as a film actor was partly a response to and partly an accommodation of. He studied music. He had the voice, and he had the seriousness about the voice. And he studied in the way of someone who has the gift and who understands that the gift requires the serious application of technique to become the thing it can be rather than the thing it simply is. He studied in Boston. He studied with teachers who confirmed what anyone who heard the voice had already understood, which was that the voice was the real thing and not the good imitation of the real thing. And then he married. Edna Pickles was her name, and the name is one of those names that the biographies of the people who married people with such names tend to mention quickly and move past, because the name is not the point, and the dwelling on the name would be the kind of unkindness that the woman whose name it was does not deserve. She was a woman from Boston. She was a woman whom Walter Pidgeon loved in the genuine way and who loved him. They married in 1921. She died in 1922. She died in childbirth, which is the specific form of death that the medical knowledge of 1922 had not yet fully equipped the medical profession to prevent, in cases of the specific complication that Edna Pidgeon's delivery produced. The child died with her. Walter Pidgeon was 25 years old. He had been married for 1 year. He had lost his wife and his child in the same event. He had been, in the period between the marriage and the death, the man who was going to be a singer, who was working toward the career that the voice was going to make possible, the career that the study in Boston had been preparing, the career that the love and the marriage and the child were the domestic accompaniment to. After the death, he was a different person. This is not the romantic language of biography that describes loss as transformation in order to give the loss a narrative function. It is the specific observation of people who knew him before the death and people who knew him after, who describe a difference in the quality of his engagement with his own life that the death produced. Not the melodramatic difference of a man who is visibly destroyed by grief, but the quieter difference of a man who has organized himself in the aftermath of the loss, around the specific management of the interior life that the loss produced in a way that was not the same organization he had had before. He left Boston. He went to New York. He was in New York in the early 1920s, doing the work that was available to a man with his qualities in the theater of that era. Musical theater, the form that his voice was most suited to, and that the Broadway of the early 1920s was producing in quantity. In the specific era of the American musical theater that was developing the form that it would become in the subsequent decades, he was in several Broadway productions. He received attention. The attention was the attention that a voice of his quality received in a theatrical environment that understood voices, specific, professional, grounded in the assessment of what the voice could do and what the productions could use the voice for. He was not a star. He was a performer with a remarkable voice who was building the professional record that the theater builds in the people who are serious about it, one production at a time, one role at a time. He came to Hollywood in 1925. He came because Hollywood was where the money was, and because Hollywood was, by the mid-1920s, where the entertainment industry's center of gravity had shifted in a way that the performers who were working in the other entertainment forms were beginning to understand as the direction of the professional future. He came because the transition to sound film, which was coming, not yet arrived, but coming, visible on the horizon of the industry in ways that the people paying attention could see, was going to be a transition that favored people who had what Walter Pidgeon had, which was the voice. The silent films he made in the late 1920s were the films of a transition period. He was not silent film's natural medium, for the obvious reason. But he was in the industry, and he was working, and he was developing the screen presence that the sound era would require, in addition to the voice, the specific quality of the face, and the manner that the camera finds and uses in the way that the camera is different from the stage in what it finds and uses. Sound came. It came in 1927 with the jazz singer, and it came in the way of technological revolutions in industries, which is faster than the people who have organized their professional practices around the preceding technology find comfortable. Walter Pidgeon was ready. The voice was there, and the voice was what the sound era needed from its leading men, along with the face and the manner and the professional reliability. And he had all of it in the combination that MGM found commercially useful. He was signed by MGM. He was put into films. The films of the early 1930s were the films of a contract player who was developing the specific qualities that the studio system requires of its leading men. Not the qualities of the biggest stars, but the qualities of the men who appear opposite the biggest female stars and who give those stars what they need in a scene partner without competing with them for the audience's primary attention. He married again in 1931. Ruth Walker was the woman, and the marriage was the marriage that lasted until her death in 1984, which is 53 years, which is the specific kind of marriage that the people who maintain it do not always receive the recognition for, because the recognition tends to go to the work rather than to the specific sustained commitment of the domestic life. The marriage was, by the accounts of the people who knew them, genuine. Two people who had found in each other something that worked and who maintained the working of it across 53 years of a professional life that was organized around the things that professional lives are organized around rather than around the marriage. He was good to her. He was, by every account, genuinely good to Ruth Walker Pidgeon across 53 years. This is the thing about Walter Pidgeon that the real obituary wants to stay with for a moment, because the being good to her for 53 years is itself a fact that tells you something about who he was, something that the catalog of films does not tell you in the same way. The films came. Mrs. Miniver in 1942 with Greer Garson, directed by William Wyler. The film is a war film in the sense that it is set against the background of the Second World War, and that the war is the pressure that the domestic life of the Miniver family is organized around resisting and surviving. It is a domestic film in the sense that what it is actually about is the specific quality of a family life that is worth preserving, that has the specific density of genuine human connection and genuine human warmth that makes the preservation of it the thing that the sacrifice of the war is for. He played Clem Miniver. He played him with the specific quality that the role required, which was the quality of a good man, not a complicated man, not a man with the specific interior darkness that the roles that produce Academy Award nominations tend to require, but a genuinely good man, the kind of man who is good in the specific way of men who are genuinely so, rather than performing the goodness because the performance is required. The film won the Academy Award for Best Picture. Greer Garson won Best Actress. Walter Pidgeon was nominated for Best Actor. He did not win. He was, across his career, nominated for the Academy Award twice, for Mrs. Miniver and for Madame Curie, also with Greer Garson, and he did not win either time, which is the specific pattern of a man whose work is consistently of a quality that the Academy recognizes as award-worthy, and who consistently does not receive the award, which is its own form of recognition and its own form of not quite being the recognition. How Green Was My Valley, also 1941, directed by John Ford. The film won the Academy Award for Best Picture over Citizen Kane, which is a decision that subsequent film history has had opinions about, and which I will not adjudicate here beyond noting that the decision was the decision, and that How Green Was My Valley, whatever its relative position in the pantheon of 1941 cinema, is a film of genuine quality, and that Walter Pidgeon's performance in it is a performance of genuine quality. He was, across the MGM years, one of the studio's most reliable leading men. The specific quality of his reliability was the quality that the studio system valued perhaps more consistently than it valued the more explosive forms of stardom. The quality of a man who could be trusted to do the work at the level the work required consistently without the production difficulties that the more spectacular talents sometimes produced. He was the man the studio could count on. This is not a diminishment. In the specific ecology of the studio system, the man the studio could count on was an essential resource. And the fact that the resource was used efficiently rather than glorified extravagantly was the studio system's limitation rather than the man's. Now, the horrible truth. I have been building to this, and the building has been necessary because the horrible truth about Walter Pidgeon is not horrible in the way that the phrase horrible truth tends to imply. It is not a revelation of something shameful, not the exposure of behavior that the person being exposed should feel shame about. It is horrible in a different and in some ways more important sense. It is the truth of what was done to a man, not the truth of what the man did. Walter Pidgeon was gay. This is the fact that the published obituary did not include, and that the published accounts of his life have not consistently included, and that the specific silence about in the professional and social world of the Hollywood of the 1940s and 1950s was maintained with the specific completeness that the Hollywood of that era maintained such silences. He was gay. He had relationships with men across the period of his career that the industry knew about and that the industry managed in the way it managed such information, which was by not including it in the public account and by organizing the professional and social environment around the accommodation of the fact without the acknowledgement of the fact. The marriage to Ruth Walker was a marriage. It lasted 53 years. She was a woman he genuinely cared for and who genuinely cared for him. The nature of what the marriage was and what it contained and what each party understood about the other party and what each party required of the arrangement is the kind of information that the marriage itself, which was a private institution between two private people, is not required to make public, and which I am not going to pretend to know in the specific detail that would require access to the private interior of the arrangement that is simply not available. What is available? From the accounts of the people in the industry who were present in those years and who have spoken about it in the specific way of people speaking about something that was known within a specific community and that the community maintained in the specific way of communities that maintain such things, is the outline of who Walter Pidgeon was in the parts of his life that the marriage and the public career did not account for. He was, in the specific social world of the Hollywood of the 1940s and 1950s, part of the community of gay men and gay-adjacent men who existed within the industry in the specific way of a community that is present and recognized within the industry, and that is invisible to the public that consumes what the industry produces. The community had its specific geography, the parties, the houses, the specific social events where the presence was possible in a way that the public events were not. And Walter Pidgeon was part of that geography in the way of a man who is living two lives with the specific skill that the era required of men in his position. The skill was, by the accounts of people who knew him in both the public and the private dimensions, considerable. He was not, in the specific way of some of his contemporaries in the same situation, at risk of the exposure that the era's combination of legal jeopardy and commercial consequence made the specific fear of men in his position. He was careful. He was discreet. He maintained the public version of himself with the same professional reliability that he maintained the public version of himself as an actor. Consistently, without the carelessness that would have produced the specific vulnerability that the exposure represented. The carelessness he was most at risk of was not the carelessness of behavior, but the carelessness of care. The care that a man in his situation requires for the people he is in relationship with, in the hidden part of the life where the care cannot be expressed in the ways that care is ordinarily expressed in the relationships of people who are not required to maintain the hiding. The people he cared for in the hidden part of the life could not receive the care in the ordinary ways. The care was expressed in the specific, bounded, private ways available to it. This is the horrible truth about Walter Pidgeon. Not the being gay, that is not horrible, that is simply who he was. The horrible truth is what the era required of him for being who he was. The hiding, the performance of a different version of himself for the public consumption. The specific cost of the half-life that the era imposed on the people who were required to live it. The half-life is the horrible truth. The life that was fully livable was the half that was hidden, and the half that was visible was the half that was managed. And the management across 50 years of a career that produced Mrs. Miniver and How Green Was My Valley and the Academy Award nominations, and the specific, consistent quality of professional excellence that the MGM years generated, the management cost what it cost. What it cost. Let me be specific about this because the specificity is what the real obituary owes the man, and what the published obituary was not in a position to provide. It cost the full inhabitation of the roles that required the full inhabitation. He was good in Mrs. Miniver. He was genuinely good. But the specific quality of genuine goodness that he brought to Clem Miniver was a quality of genuine goodness that was organized, at least in part, around the specific understanding of what it means to maintain a version of yourself for the world that is real but not complete. To give the world a genuine part of yourself while keeping a genuine part of yourself in the place where the world is not. The Clem Miniver, who is warm and present and devoted to the family while the war is trying to take the family, is the character of a man who understands the specific quality of domestic life as something that requires the deliberate investment of the self. And the understanding was not only the actor's craft, but the actor's life. It cost the relationships in the hidden part of the life the specific quality that any relationship loses when it cannot be full. Cannot be full in the sense of being present in the world. Cannot be full in the sense of receiving the social confirmation and support that the world extends to relationships it recognizes and withholds from relationships it does not recognize. Cannot be full in the sense of simply being what it is without the management. It cost Ruth Walker something that the 53 years of the marriage accounts for in the broad stroke, without accounting for in the specific texture. She was in a marriage. The marriage lasted 53 years. What the marriage was in its specific interior, what each party knew and what each party had decided to know and what each party had decided to not know, is the kind of private knowledge that the private institution of the marriage holds and that is not available for the public account. What can be said is that the marriage was the specific arrangement that the era required of two people in the specific positions they were in, and that the arrangement had costs for both of them that are not fully recoverable from the outside. He continued to work after the MGM years. The 1950s and 1960s were the years of the career's extended life. Science Fiction in Forbidden Planet in 1956, which was a production that the serious leading man of the MGM years would not have appeared in a decade earlier, and that the changed commercial landscape of Hollywood in 1956 made available as the kind of work that was available. He was professional and he was good, and he gave the productions what they needed. He was, in the 1960s and 1970s, in the specific professional position of the former leading man who is in the late stage of a career that has lasted long enough to reach the specific form of recognition that the very late stage of very long careers sometimes receives, which is the recognition that is organized around the career's length rather than around its peak. He received that recognition. He was honored in the way that long careers are honored, not with the award that the work at the peak should have received, but with the tribute that the survival deserves. Ruth died in 1984. They had been married for 53 years. He died 4 months later. He was 87 years old. The published obituary ran. It listed the films. It noted the Academy Award nominations. It mentioned the marriage, the length of it, the specific form of tribute that a 53-year marriage receives in an obituary. It described a man of professional excellence and personal reliability who had given the MGM years what the MGM years required, and who had been good to the people around him in the way that the people around him consistently described. It was accurate. It was not the real obituary. The real obituary is the one I have been trying to write tonight, and it says this: Walter Pidgeon was a man who lived in two worlds for 60 years. He lived in the world that the public knew, the world of the MGM leading man, the dependable professional, the man who was good to his wife and good to the productions and good in the films. And he lived in the world that the public did not know, the world that the era required him to keep behind the first world, hidden and managed and existing in the specific, bounded, private way of lives that the world outside them does not acknowledge. Both worlds were real. Both were him. The man in the first world was not a performance of a man who did not exist. He was genuinely warm and genuinely decent and genuinely professional and genuinely good to Ruth and genuinely committed to the work. These things were real. The man in the second world was also real. He was who he was, and who he was included something that the era required him to keep in the second world. And the keeping of it in the second world was the half-life that the era imposed, and that the era was wrong to impose, and that the wrong of the imposition was not something that Walter Pidgeon or Ruth Walker or the people who knew them in both worlds were in a position to challenge in the era that was imposing it. Nobody dared to tell. Nobody told because the telling was not possible in the specific way of things that are not possible in the specific contexts that make them not possible. The industry knew. The industry managed the knowing in the specific way of an institution that has organized itself around the management of information that complicates the commercial product. Nobody dared to tell for 87 years. Now I have told it. Not as exposure, not as the violation of a privacy that was maintained with the specific skill and the specific cost and the specific dignity of a man who understood that the maintenance was what the era required and who maintained it anyway, consistently, across 60 years of a professional life that was one of the most consistently excellent in the history of the MGM years. But as the real obituary, the one that says, he was who he was. He was good at what he did. He was good to the people around him. He lived in two worlds for 60 years and maintained both with the specific dignity of a man who understands that the dignity is the thing that the maintaining requires, and that the requiring of the maintaining is the era's wrong and not the man's. He was 87 years old when he died. He had been in the industry for 60 years. He had been nominated for the Academy Award twice. He had been in some of the most significant films of the 1940s. He had been married for 53 years to a woman he genuinely cared for. And he had been, for 60 years, the man that nobody dared to tell the truth about. Now you know. Sleep well, my friend. And the next time you see him on screen, in Mrs. Miniver, in How Green Was My Valley, in any of the 60 years of films, see both men. The one in the frame and the one behind it. They were both real. They were both him. They were both, for 60 years, present in every performance he gave. The voice carried them both. It was one of the finest voices that the cinema of the 20th century ever found. And it belonged, completely and without remainder, to both men.